If you believe Iran is successfully holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage with a few speedboats and a handful of sea mines, you are watching a war that stopped existing years ago. We've been fed the narrative of an asymmetric standoff, a desperate regime using low-cost ordnance to force a superpower to blink. That is the theater Tehran wants you to buy. It is not the reality. Washington has stopped playing the game of deterrence. They have shifted to the game of systematic removal. The era of psychological leverage is over. The era of attrition has begun. What is the most dangerous naval weapon Iran still has in the Strait of Hormuz? Not a destroyer, not a submarine, not even a missile battery on shore. A small boat, low to the water, cheap to build, easy to hide. Dangerous not because it can win a battle, but because it can poison an entire corridor with doubt. That is the first thing people miss about Hormuz. Iran never needed to defeat the United States Navy there. It only needed to make the act of passing through the strait feel intolerably risky. That is a very different mission, and it is much cheaper. For years, that was Tehran's real maritime trick, not dominance. Disruption, not sea control in the classic sense. Psychological control, a fast boat moving close to shore at the wrong hour. A mine laid in the right patch of water, a rumor that another one may already be there. That is all it takes to shake insurers, freeze ship owners, and make traders start building fear into the price of oil before a single tanker is actually lost. That is why these mine boats matter more than their size suggests. A conventional navy is visible, it can be counted, tracked, and targeted. A mine boat plays a different game. It hides in coastal clutter. It slips between fishing traffic, island cover, and commercial lanes. It does not need to survive for long. It does not need to sink multiple ships. It only needs to leave behind one thing: uncertainty. And uncertainty in a choke point like Hormuz has a blast radius far larger than the boat carrying it. Think about the geography. Hormuz is not just narrow. It is predictable. Traffic moves through known lanes. Commercial vessels are large, slow, and tightly constrained by route discipline. That makes the strait brutally efficient for asymmetric warfare. Iran understood that long ago. It did not need a blue water navy to create leverage there. Geography was already doing half the work. A weak naval actor can look stronger than it is when the corridor itself does most of the trapping. That logic became even more important after Iran's conventional naval strength was badly degraded. Once the larger ships are sunk, damaged, or pushed off the board, the surviving tool is the one that can still create chaos cheaply. That is where the mine boats come in. They are not glamorous, they are not impressive in a parade. But they are cheap, expendable, deniable enough to create confusion, and dangerous enough to force a superpower to react far out of proportion to their size. A superpower sees a small boat, global markets see a risk premium. And that is where the strategy becomes real. Naval mines are not frightening because they are glamorous. They are frightening because they turn ordinary movement into a gamble. A captain does not have to see a mine for the mine to matter. A company does not have to lose a ship for the route to become commercially toxic. Even the suspicion of mines can slow traffic, reroute voyages, raise freight costs, and trap energy flows before the first real detonation ever happens. That is why Iran's last naval card is not a fleet. It is a delivery system for fear. A mine boat is not trying to conquer the sea. It is trying to make the sea feel unusable. And that is exactly why Washington is moving to kill this strategy at its source. Not because the boats are large, because they are small enough to matter in all the wrong ways. If the United States can strip Iran of this final asymmetric tool, then Tehran loses more than a few cheap platforms. It loses the ability to turn fear into leverage at the narrowest and most important maritime choke point on Earth. That was the old game in Hormuz. A weaker power created enough doubt to make the world hesitate. The next phase begins when Washington decides hesitation is over. For years, Iran's mine boats survived on one thing above all else. Not speed, not stealth, not firepower. Hesitation. That was the oxygen of the whole strategy. A small boat slips out. A few mines go into the water. The other side sees it, suspects it, tracks it, and still loses precious minutes asking the usual questions. Is this confirmed? Who authorizes the strike? What are the escalation risks? That delay was never a side effect. It was part of the weapon. Tehran built maritime leverage inside that pause between detection and response. Trump just moved to destroy that pause. A blockade is one level of pressure, mine clearing is another. But ordering American forces to find Iranian mine-laying boats and kill them on sight is something harsher. It is not a warning. It is not a signal wrapped in diplomatic language. It is a rules of engagement shift that changes the meaning of the battle space itself. Once a mine boat is no longer a gray zone nuisance but a pre-authorized target, the logic that kept it alive begins to collapse. That is why the wording matters. Shoot and kill, no hesitation, no procedural drag, no waiting for the political weather to clear. Iran's small boat strategy was always designed to exploit exactly those seams the moment where a superpower sees the threat but still has not fully decided to act. Washington has now decided in advance. That changes everything. The mine boat is no longer operating inside ambiguity. It is operating inside a kill decision that has already been made. And that is only the first half of the shift. The second half is what the United States is doing to the water itself. Trump ordered mine-sweeping operations to continue at a tripled-up pace. That matters because mines do not create leverage forever. They create leverage for as long as they remain in the water and inside the imagination of everyone forced to navigate around them. The longer they sit there, the more they poison routes, insurance, energy, pricing, and confidence. Remove them faster and you do more than clear a channel. You collapse the shelf life of Iran's coercion. You cut panic down before it matures into paralysis. That is where the American system starts to look less like containment and more like a hunt. USS Chief, USS Pioneer, USS Tulsa, underwater drones, mine countermeasure crews, ISR overhead, surface ships securing the perimeter, aircraft waiting for target quality exposure. This is not one action, it is a layered machine. The minesweepers clean, the drones search, the sensors classify, the ships hold the box. The aircraft finishes what it exposes itself. That is a nightmare for a small mine boat. Because a mine boat was dangerous when it could disappear into clutter and force the other side to think twice. Now, the clutter is being watched. The water is being searched. The permission is already granted. And once those three things happen at the same time, the tactical advantages of being small begin to reverse. Small means harder to defend. Small means easier to erase. Small means one pass, one burst, one missile, one drone-fed strike, and the platform is gone before it ever converts fear into leverage. That is the strategic reversal now underway in Hormuz. Iran's mine boats once mattered because they were cheap, deniable, and awkward to hit quickly. Washington is stripping away all three of those advantages at once. Cheap no longer matters if the boat cannot survive long enough to matter. Deniability no longer matters if persistent surveillance catches the act in real time. Political awkwardness no longer matters if the trigger has already been cleared before the boat even leaves port. So this is no longer just a story about reopening the strait. It is a story about removing the one maritime tool Iran still believed could make the world blink. Because every strategy built on ambiguity has the same weakness. It survives only as long as the gray zone survives with it. Washington has now decided to drown that gray zone in surveillance minesweepers and immediate lethal authority. Once that happens, Iran's mine boats stop functioning as leverage. They become targets. What does Iran actually lose if these mine boats start disappearing? Not just hulls, not just engines, not just a few crews pulled out of the water. It loses its cheapest way to make the world respect its weakness. That is the real stake here. A mine boat is not valuable because it is impressive. It is valuable because it turns a weak position into a dangerous one. It lets a regime with a battered navy still reach out and touch global energy markets. It gives Tehran a way to turn geography into leverage fear, into cost, and cost into bargaining power. Strip that away and the loss is not tactical first. It is psychological, then economics, then politics. Because these boats were never just naval platforms, they were economic weapons. Every time a mine is laid, the target is not only the ship that might hit it, the target is the route, the insurer, the charter rate, the delivery schedule, the refinery is waiting on crude. The government is praying oil prices do not spike before the weekend. That is why a mine boat matters so much more than its size suggests. It reaches far beyond the water around it. A small fiberglass hull can send pressure into boardrooms, ministries, commodity desks, and shipping lanes thousands of miles away. That is an extraordinary return on a very cheap instrument, and Tehran knows it. Now reverse the equation. What happens when the mine boat itself becomes the fragile part of the system? The whole coercive model starts to bend. Because the old formula depended on a cruel asymmetry. Iran could threaten a globally important waterway with something cheap, deniable, and difficult to hit quickly. The other side had to absorb the political risk of acting. Tehran only had to create enough danger to make caution feel rational. That was the trade. But once Washington decides to destroy the boats instead of managing around them, that trade begins to collapse. The instrument of fear stops being protected by ambiguity. It starts living under a death sentence. And once that happens, the economic consequences hit Iran twice. First, the regime loses the ability to keep Hormuz commercially toxic at low cost. Fewer mines in the water means fewer reasons for markets to keep pricing panic into the corridor. Fewer mine boats surviving means fewer chances to recreate that panic tomorrow night or the night after. The second blow is harsher. The blockade becomes easier to sustain. The less Iran can threaten the passage itself, the harder it becomes to resist the strangulation of its own exports. That is where the real damage begins. Because the mine boat was never just a weapon of disruption. It was covered. It was the last maritime tool Iran had for making the cost of pressure spill outward onto everybody else. Remove that tool and the pressure stops spreading outward. It starts collapsing inward, toward Tehran, toward the regime, toward the budget, the patronage, networks, the salaries, and the chain of control that all depend on oil continuing to move and fear continuing to work. That is why the death of these boats would matter far beyond the strait. It would mean Iran is no longer able to make the world share enough of its pain. And once that happens, the regime begins to absorb the full weight of its own crisis. That is when the numbers stop being abstract. Lost exports, frozen cash flow, delayed salaries, hardliners fighting over a shrinking pool of resources. A state that can still shout but can no longer distribute enough reward to keep every loyal hand steady. And that is where the strategic message becomes bigger than Iran. If Washington can destroy the mine-laying system fast enough, then it proves something cold and important. Cheap maritime coercion only works until a stronger power decides to hunt the delivery system instead of just enduring the threat. That lesson will be read in Tehran first. But it will not stay in Tehran. Every state, every navy, every energy market watching Hormuz will understand what it means. So no, this is not about a few small boats. It is about whether Iran can still convert chaos into leverage, whether it can still turn cheap disruption into global hesitation, whether it can still force the world to blink before it does. If the mine boats die, those answers begin to die with them. Because once the last cheap maritime weapon stops working, Tehran loses more than hardware. It loses the final illusion that fear alone can still keep its position afloat. So what is this really about? A few mine boats, a few minutes, a narrow strip of water? No. It is about something much larger than that. It is about whether a weakened regime can still make the world pay for its weakness. For years, Iran could. Not by ruling the sea, by poisoning it. Not by defeating stronger navies. By making stronger navies think twice before acting. That was the trick. Cheap hulls, cheap mines, expensive fear. And in Hormuz, fear was often enough. But fear has a shelf life, especially when the other side stops treating it as a message and starts treating it as a target. That is the turn now. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, structural. Washington is no longer trying to live with the mine threat. It is moving to rip out the delivery system behind it, kill the boat, clear the water, collapse the leverage. Simple, brutal, effective. And if that works, Tehran loses more than a tactic. It loses the last maritime trick that lets it look larger than it really was. That is when the pressure changes direction. No longer outward into oil markets and shipping routes. Inward. Into budgets, into patronage, into salaries, into the nerves of a regime that has long depended on one formula. Make the world nervous enough, and maybe the world will carry part of your burden for you. What happens when that formula stops working? That is the real question. Because once the sea stops carrying Iran's fear outward, Iran has to absorb the weight of its own crisis alone. And that is when systems start to crack. So watch the mine boats, not because they are big, because they are small enough to tell you whether Tehran still has any leverage left at all. In your view, if that leverage is broken, what fails first inside Iran? The strategy, the money, or the regime's grip on itself? Leave your take in the comments. And follow the channel because the next phase of this story may arrive more quietly than people expect. It will not arrive more gently.